I believe that every cheater should be held accountable, so they never even consider cheating again. I couldn't say anything bad about my wife. She was an angel to me, at least until the day I caught her cheating. After that, I felt an overwhelming urge to make her life a living nightmare. Whether or not I succeeded, you'll find out soon. Life had been quite hectic at home and work lately. I had been putting in extra effort dealing with recurring machine breakdowns at work. After weeks of analyzing breakdown statistics and presenting data, I finally convinced my boss to implement a proactive servicing plan rather than waiting for equipment to fail before fixing it. My evenings were dedicated to this project for several weeks, but I always made sure to reserve weekends to spend time with my wife, Caroline. Caroline, my attractive 42-year-old wife, was equally busy with her job as an administrative assistant at a local college. The college had recently received a requires improvement rating from Ofsted, triggering a thorough review and the implementation of an improvement program. As a result, she often worked late, both at the office and at home. Yet, like me, she prioritized weekends for us, especially when our son, Jason, visited from university with his girlfriend. When I checked the weather forecast for the upcoming weekend, it looked promising. After a long, wet, and cold winter, I wanted to surprise Caroline with a getaway. We own a static caravan on the south coast, near Christchurch, located in a holiday park. It was winterized for the season, but I decided to take a day off work to prepare it for a cozy weekend, just the two of us. That I planned everything carefully to keep it a surprise. I told my boss I'd be taking Tuesday off, explaining the situation in case Caroline called the office. I also let Caroline think I had an early meeting that day and warned her I might be home late due to traffic. I packed my laptop to stay available for any urgent work and headed to the caravan. Upon arrival, I went about the usual routine to winterize the van. I had left the keys on the hook at home so Caroline wouldn't notice them missing. Instead, I relied on the spare key we kept hidden under the van. To my surprise, the key wasn't in its usual spot. Using my phone's light, I found it misplaced and at a strange angle, not where I had securely placed it months ago. Once inside the caravan, I noticed other peculiarities. The fridge, which I always left open during the winter to prevent odor and mold, was closed. Expecting the worst, I opened it, but there was no smell or mold. In fact, the entire van smelled fresher than it should after being shut up all winter. This raised a red flag. Had someone been using it? I began inspecting further. The water taps, which I had drained and left open to prevent freezing, were shut, and there was a small spurt of water when I turned them on. That shouldn't have been the case. Jason, our son, would have known to leave the taps open, and he wouldn't have come here without telling us. Next, I checked the electricity meter. I know how much electricity the van usually uses over the winter. It's not much. A quick check showed it had consumed a massive amount compared to previous years. I didn't have the exact numbers with me, so I made a note to double-check when I got home. I took a picture of the meter with my phone and sent Jason a text asking if he had used the van over the winter. I meticulously inspected the van, but everything seemed in order. Still, I remained cautious. I started taking things out, airing the bedding that had been stored in sealed bags and washed beforehand. Once that was done, I decided to make some coffee. It would have to be black since I hadn't brought any milk, but that wasn't a big deal. While I prefer my tea and coffee with milk, I can manage without it. I put the kettle on and noticed there was a bit of water left in it. I would have expected it to evaporate over the winter, even with the lid on. Just another odd detail to note. While waiting for the kettle to boil, I began wiping and dusting everything. When I checked the coffee jar, I was surprised to find it nearly full. I distinctly remembered it being almost empty when we left. I checked the expiration date, and it was still good for another 6 months. We usually don't leave much in the van over the winter since our Christmas trips are inconvenient, requiring us to bring almost everything from home. Yet another strange detail to add to my list. I considered calling Caroline but decided against it. If someone had been in the van, she might feel it was contaminated and wouldn't want to return. I needed to figure it out on my own and possibly keep it to myself. Hopefully, it was just Jason. Besides, she was likely busy, and I didn't want to ruin my surprise. I finished sorting out the van and headed home, taking the roses with me since there was no point in leaving them there. I thought I could surprise Caroline with them instead. On my way out, I stopped by the site office and casually asked if anyone had noticed activity near our van recently. The staff said they hadn't seen anyone, but they mentioned a fairly new red Mercedes estate parked a few vans down from ours every couple of weeks. It was odd because people who drive cars like that don't typically frequent holiday caravan parks, and the car was red, making it memorable. They figured it was legitimate since the gate required swipe access in the winter, meaning whoever it was must have had a pass. The office staff didn't have much to do during the winter, so they tended to notice unusual details. As I drove home, stuck in traffic, my mind began to wander. Who could have been using the van, and how would they know where the key was? Only 3 of us had access. While sitting in the traffic jam, Jason called. It wasn't him. I told him I suspected someone had been using the van but asked him to keep it to himself. I didn't want to worry his mother, who was already dealing with the Ofsted review at work. So, if it wasn't me or Jason, could it have been Caroline? But why? I started reviewing the classic signs of someone having an affair. She didn't dress differently. She didn't rush to the shower as soon as she got home. She did work late, but I was always aware of it, and her phone tracking showed she was where she said she would be. However, her phone wasn't always on, and there were areas in the college with no signal. Our intimacy hadn't changed much, though it might have decreased slightly because of how hard we were both working. Sitting in yet another traffic jam, a piece of advice I had heard before came to mind: trust but verify. I began formulating a plan. In fact, I came up with several plans. First, I needed to protect myself. If we separated for any reason, the law dictated everything would be split 50-50ths. I loved the house we had lived in for the past 15 years and the work I had put into it. I had also spent countless hours restoring my pride and joy, a maroon MGB GT V8, and I wasn't prepared to lose it. Our savings account was in good shape, largely due to the overtime I worked. If my suspicions turned out to be wrong, no harm done. The next step was to set up some cameras in the van. I planned to visit the van later in the week, detour to the spy shop in Southampton, and pick up Wi-Fi cameras and possibly a tracking device for her car or handbag. I had the entire plan mapped out in my mind. To test things immediately, I called Caroline on the home line. She answered right away, so at least I knew she was home. She told me she hadn't prepared anything for dinner since she wasn't sure when I'd return. I said I was 10 minutes away, and she suggested I pick up fish and chips, pizza, or Chinese food. She asked how my meeting went, and I said it was fine but that something had come up, which I'd explain later. I asked how her day was, and she said it had been hectic but that they were making progress and might have a plan in a couple of weeks. However, it would mean more late nights. I told her I was fine with that as long as we had weekends together. She giggled and said she was looking forward to the weekend because she had something planned for us. Hearing her voice, I found it hard to believe the love of my life could be having an affair. I started feeling ashamed of my suspicions, but I needed to figure out who had been in the van. The plan had to proceed in full. For the second test, I picked up a meat feast pizza, my favorite, though not hers. When I got home, everything seemed normal. There was even a bottle of wine on the table, which was unusual for a Tuesday, but I didn't think much of it. I opened the pizza box, and she immediately noticed it was a meat feast. I placed a couple of slices on her plate. "Sweetheart, you know I don't like the meatballs on this," she said, her initial light-hearted tone shifting to one of slight irritation. "Just put them over here, and I'll swap my pepperoni for them." That's what we'd done in the past, but she had never been grumpy about it before. Was I imagining things, or was I now looking for problems that weren't there? As she carefully transferred a meatball from her pizza to mine, halfway across the table, I decided to test the waters. I began casually, "I heard a rumor that someone at your workplace is having an affair." Her hand froze, and the meatball fell onto the table. I picked it up and ate it, making light of the moment. "I like meatballs," I joked. "Where did you hear that?" she asked, her tone more serious now. "At the meeting today," I replied. "Someone mentioned your college and said a guy named Julian was caught having an affair with a colleague." "There's nobody at our place named Julian." "They must have gotten it wrong," she said, but her reaction stuck with me. Her slight pause and the way she dropped the meatball planted a nagging suspicion in my mind. Did she know something? I pressed on casually. "Do you have some kind of moral clause in your contract? You know, about associating with married individuals, especially in front of impressionable students?" "Well, I think there is, but I'd have to double-check." "Why the sudden interest?" she asked. "It's the chaos something like this can cause," I said, keeping my tone light. "Shattered lives, people left financially unstable. Everything has to be split 50-50, and there's often not much to go around. 2 marriages destroyed, 4 lives impacted, and someone even lost their job. If there's no Julian, maybe they confused the colleges. Still, it's troubling, isn't it? Someone breaks their marriage vows and ends up with half of everything, no matter the damage." She didn't respond immediately. I noticed her face pale slightly, and she ate her pizza in silence. My unease grew. After dinner, we sat down to watch something on TV, as usual. But tonight, there was an unusual lack of conversation. I began questioning if I was overanalyzing minor occurrences. Still, I resolved to proceed cautiously. The next step would be risky but necessary for my peace of mind. Around 9 p.m., her phone rang, making her jump. She glanced at the screen and said, "It's my sister. I have to take this." Without waiting, she left for the kitchen with her phone. This behavior was unusual. Normally, she'd answer calls in front of me and sometimes even include me in the conversation. Curious, I turned up the volume on the TV and quietly made my way toward the kitchen to eavesdrop. I caught bits of her conversation. "Sorry, darling, we're occupied at the moment. I'll call you tomorrow. Goodbye." Her tone was rushed. Then, after a pause, she said, "I think he's figured it out. Stay away from me tomorrow." Another pause. "He's behaving strangely. I can't risk losing him. No promotion is worth my marriage." That was all I needed to hear. I returned to the couch, pretending nothing had happened. My mind raced as I mindlessly watched the TV. When she returned, I casually asked, "How's your sister?" "She's fine," she replied. Emily hurt her knee, typical tomboy stuff. Then she snuggled up to me and whispered, "I think it's bedtime if you catch my drift." I tried my best, but it was hard to focus when doubts clouded my mind. Afterward, as she lay in my arms, I commented, "That was unusual for a weekday. What's gotten into you?" She smiled softly. "I just adore my man. We haven't had much time during the week lately." I prodded a bit. "So, it's not guilt, then?" She didn't respond, which left me even more unsettled. The next morning, I followed my usual routine but called my boss to let him know I was taking another day off. My doubts had grown too large to ignore. After a quick breakfast, I visited a local thrift store and purchased a second-hand smartphone. I made a brief stop at the library to create Gmail and Hotmail email accounts using their computer. Afterward, I went to a nearby supermarket and purchased a SIM-only mobile phone plan under these new email addresses. It wasn't a significant expense, and if Caroline proved innocent, I could easily discard them. However, if she were guilty, it would be money well spent. On my way to the van, I detoured to a spy shop in Southampton and purchased 2 Wi-Fi cameras and a tracker, which could be placed in her car or handbag. Once back at the van, I installed the cameras, connecting them to the Wi-Fi. One camera was positioned to monitor the bedroom, while the other covered the lounge and kitchen area. Fortunately, I had access to mains power, so there was no need for batteries. These cameras were motion-activated and would send video directly to my new phone when triggered. As an additional measure, I emptied an old jar of coffee and replaced most of it with crushed sleeping tablets left over from Caroline's mother's visit. I wasn't certain of the dosage, so I added enough to slightly alter the coffee's hue. I made a mental note to bring another jar next time I visited. Deep down, I still hoped my suspicions were unfounded. On the drive home, I passed by her college and noticed a recently registered red Mercedes estate in the parking lot. Upon returning home, I organized some paperwork, trying to keep an open mind. Although I had strong suspicions that she was having an affair, I needed to remain objective in case I was wrong. That evening, as we went to bed, Caroline became affectionate again, which struck me as unusual. I looked at her and remarked, "We haven't been intimate during the week for months, and now you're interested 2 nights in a row. Is everything okay? Maybe your boyfriend isn't meeting your needs during the week." Her shocked expression was priceless. "Are you accusing me of having an affair?" she retorted. "I was just curious about the sudden change in behavior," I replied. "We've been reserving that for weekends, and now it's twice in 2 nights. It's quite a shift. Are you suggesting I'm having an affair?" she repeated. "If the shoe fits," I replied bluntly. That silenced her. It was nonsense, of course, but it had the desired effect. Things grew tense after that. We didn't even engage in simple gestures of affection. Despite everything, I cared for her deeply and began devising an exit plan for her in case she wanted one. At the same time, I was preparing to safeguard myself if she didn't. On Thursday evening, I arrived home with everything ready. Caroline looked beautiful as I walked in, seeming torn between reconciling and not appearing overly eager. Dinner wasn't my favorite meal, but it was close. She had even opened a bottle of wine. Dinner was pleasant, and we talked about mundane topics, my projects, her college, their plans to address their challenges, and the general progress being made. To disrupt the routine, I did something unusual. Normally, Caroline would clear the plates and load the dishwasher, but this time, I took care of it, deliberately placing everything in the wrong spots. She seemed surprised by my actions but didn't comment. As I sat back down at the table, I reached across and took her hands in mine. "Sweetheart, we need to talk," I began. Her expression dropped. Looking directly into her eyes, I said, "My love for you knows no bounds. I can't imagine life without you." I paused for a moment. "But this whole Julian situation has me concerned. We've put so much effort into building a wonderful home, raising our son, and creating a life we cherish. Yet, if one of us messes up, we both suffer the consequences. So, I've come up with a plan. It's not something either of us will like, but it's the best solution I could think of." She looked thoroughly bewildered, which was exactly what I wanted. I pulled a sheet of paper and a pen from my pocket and turned it toward her. The header read "Postnuptial Agreement." I could see her frustration building. "Why?" she demanded. "Listen," I said. "In this country, even if one of us were to stray, everything would still be split 50-50ths. If I cheated, I'd walk away with half. The same goes for you. But neither of us has strayed, so this protects us both." She thought for a while before replying, "I don't want to." "Why not?" "It just doesn't feel right," she said. "What are you hiding?" I pressed. "Nothing. I love you and would never betray you." "I've got no reason to take that risk," she insisted. "Then if you're not hiding anything, what's the harm?" I countered. "It feels like you don't trust me," she said after a pause. I pretended to ponder her words, although I had anticipated her reaction. "But signing it indicates trust in our marriage," I said calmly. Her resistance wavered. "I have no intention of cheating, nor have I cheated," she finally said. "I'll sign." I picked up the pen and signed the document. "The only reason I can think of for not signing is if you've cheated on me or plan to," I said. "I would never betray you like that," she protested, tears streaming down her face, her expression betraying guilt. I was almost certain I was right, I just needed confirmation. "Then why refuse to sign?" I asked calmly. "This is a major decision that requires careful consideration," she replied. "We're talking about our future, forever. What if things don't work out?" Her point was valid, as I had already acknowledged to myself. I rose from my seat. "Take your time to think it over, and I'll consider what to do if we encounter difficulties. For now, I'm heading to the club for a beer while I ponder." I decided to visit the rugby club. Thursdays were always busy there. British rugby clubs are often populated by professionals such as doctors, solicitors, lawyers, and psychiatrists. I sought out a solicitor friend with whom I used to play rugby. As we both aged and slowed down, we switched to playing cricket together. Over a beer, I showed him my postnuptial agreement. Without looking up, he asked, "Do you suspect Caroline of infidelity?" I grinned as he finally met my gaze. "I'll need to consult my colleagues," he said, stepping away. Within the club, certain areas serve as informal hubs for discussions, like the doctor's corner for medical debates, or the solicitor's and lawyer's table for legal matters. Meanwhile, the rest of us occupied the general bar area. It may seem stratified, but it works effectively. My friend returned and surprised me with his first words, "You should treat that group over there to a couple of beers." "Why?" I asked, puzzled. "They gave you advice, made you their client, and if your marriage falls apart," he paused, showing unusual candor, "she'll poach all the best lawyers in town. The rest? Well, they probably don't know the difference between rugby and cricket." He smiled wryly. I bought the suggested beers, and we found a quiet spot to talk. "If everyone had contracts like this, we'd be out of business," he said. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He explained, "Your terms are simple and clear, no vague phrases like reasonable or considering. You've defined an extramarital affair explicitly, covering everything from intimate contact to even kissing. Will that hold up in court?" I asked. "Our in-house divorce attorney snapped a photo of it as an example," he said. "So I believe it will, though there might be a few adjustments you could make. Still, it's solid." He noted the financial terms were fair. The cheating partner would receive 1/3 of the savings and their car, while the aggrieved partner would retain the house, 2/3 of the savings, and their car. With about $160,000 in savings, the cheating partner wouldn't be left destitute. Then came the bad news. This can't apply retroactively. It only applies to the future, otherwise, it could be seen as entrapment. "Why's that?" I asked. "If she's currently having an affair, it might look like you're using this agreement to gain an unfair advantage, like keeping the house and most of the savings. Courts wouldn't look kindly on that," he explained. "That settled it. Even if she was having an affair, the agreement would stop it, and we could move forward. As for the other man, I'd deal with him later." I thanked my friend and promised to meet him next week. On my way home, I reflected on my feelings for Caroline. Despite everything, I still loved her deeply. We had shared over 2 decades together, raising Jason, and weathering life's changes. I was willing to give her another chance, perhaps foolishly, but my love for her endured. If she declined, however, consequences would follow. When I got home, she was sitting in front of the television, her face tear-streaked, but she still looked beautiful to me. Sitting beside her, I gently turned her to face me. I could see her inner turmoil, but she was silent, so I began. Darling, Julian's involvement has troubled me deeply, and I must address it. I've consulted my friends at the club about our postnuptial agreement. They've advised against backdating it. If either of us has been unfaithful in the past, it's behind us. Her reaction was one of anger, which I ignored as I continued. I'm certain I've been faithful, and while I trust you have been too, I can't prove it. Signing this agreement means moving forward together, leaving the past behind us. Her response stunned me. The overwhelming display of relief, love, and tears from her confirmed my suspicions. It was too much, too excessive. She was clearly distraught, further convincing me of her infidelity. That night, I lay awake, now certain of her betrayal but still lacking concrete evidence. The woman I adored, the mother of my child, had deceived me. Sleep eluded me, and as the hours passed, my willingness to forgive wavered. The next morning, I woke from a restless sleep, feeling drained. The smell of toast and coffee greeted me. When I made my way downstairs, I found Caroline unusually cheerful, bustling about. A pot of tea sat on the table, complete with a cozy to keep it warm. Caroline poured herself some coffee and sat across from me, taking my hands in hers. Darling, I apologize for not understanding your perspective earlier. I thought it over last night, and you're right, what Julian did, and whoever he was with, was unforgivable. With that, she produced our postnuptial agreement and an ink pen, not the cheap biro I had used, and signed it, crucially dating it as well. In that moment, I decided to leave the past behind. I resolved to overcome any lingering worries and doubts, though I acknowledged there would always be some nagging uncertainties. I vowed to monitor things carefully while keeping an eye on her behavior. That I had somewhat forgotten about our planned weekend getaway in the van, assuming there would always be another opportunity. However, my concerns resurfaced when Caroline mentioned she needed to travel to Bristol for a Monday meeting due to a colleague dropping out. Despite wanting to trust her, a small part of me remained skeptical. I pushed aside these doubts to focus on the weekend but mentally prepared myself for what might come. Caroline seemed cheerful throughout the weekend. On Saturday, I casually mentioned heading to the football club for a drink, a rare occurrence since I'm not a football fan. She didn't react, which was unusual. I could have walked since it was a short distance away, but I took the car. Her happiness must have clouded her judgment to the obvious signs. On the way, I stopped by a friend's place to borrow his car for Monday, ensuring everything was arranged. We discussed her Bristol trip. She said she'd be taking the train early Monday morning and returning Tuesday evening. A hotel had been arranged, and she assured me she'd share its location and keep her phone on for contact. Although I offered to drop her off at the station on my way to work, she declined, saying she'd be traveling with colleagues in a group minibus. It didn't make much sense since the college was already on the route to the station, but I didn't press the issue. The weekend was wonderful, but lingering doubts remained. Caroline was unusually affectionate, which should have reassured me but instead raised questions. By Sunday evening, guilt gnawed at me. If she truly boarded the train to Bristol, I'd let it go and perhaps even surprise her at the hotel. But if not, I was determined to uncover the truth. That I discreetly placed a tracker in her handbag. It was spacious enough to conceal it easily. As long as the tracker and her phone headed west together, I'd feel more at ease. However, my suspicions deepened when I noticed a small carton of milk in the fridge alongside a nearly full 2-liter bottle. When I asked about it, Caroline explained she'd been asked to bring some. But who brings milk to a hotel? My skepticism grew. Using a sharp knife and a syringe, I replaced about a third of the milk with vodka. Since she wouldn't be driving, there was no risk of accidents, but it would serve as an additional measure of control. On Monday morning, I called my boss to take another day off, though he was less than pleased. I tracked both her phone and the tracker. They both reached her workplace, but then her phone went offline, while the tracker moved south, toward the coast, not west to Bristol. Armed with this knowledge, I sprang into action. I called my friend to pick up his car, leaving mine at home along with my phone. I didn't want my car spotted anywhere suspicious. To create the illusion I was working from home, I set up my computer with a device to simulate activity, ensuring it stayed online. I checked the surveillance cameras in the van. They were operational but showed no movement. To confirm Caroline's story, I called the college and asked about the hotel arrangements. They informed me she had taken the day off. That was all the confirmation I needed. On my way out, I grabbed a tube of superglue and gloves from the garage. I drove past the college to see if a red Mercedes estate was parked nearby. There it was, further evidence tying her to the suspicions that had plagued me. My next stop was a local adult store, where I purchased a few items in cash to avoid leaving a trail. When I arrived at the holiday park, I parked my friend's car on the next street and walked to avoid drawing attention. Sure enough, the red Mercedes estate was there, though not parked directly next to our van. Notifications were buzzing on my phone during the trip. Considering I had set up alerts only for surveillance cameras, I had a pretty good idea of what they were about. After connecting to Wi-Fi, my worst suspicions were confirmed when I watched the footage from the van. Caroline and another man were inside, surrounded by a pile of clothes. It appeared they had just finished spending time together. I heard Caroline making coffee, complaining about the situation. The man suggested she add more milk to mask the taste. Afterward, they returned to bed, where she expressed her regrets, citing the risk to everything they had built together and her growing anxiety. He dismissed her concerns with confidence, mentioning legal advice and their mutual enjoyment of the affair. Despite the excitement, she confirmed her love for her partner and acknowledged the need to end the affair, referencing the looming threat of a post-nuptial agreement. However, he tried to convince her otherwise, appealing to her desire to continue. "That's interesting," said one of my friends from the rugby club, who happened to be a divorce lawyer. His voice played through the recording. Using the van was a clever idea. I might need to convince my wife to get one, a fancy one, though. She's quite strict with finances. "But you have that fancy Mercedes," Caroline replied. "That's her money," the man said. "You don't think a college deputy principal could afford one, do you?" "I do better than your mechanic husband." "Don't criticize him." Caroline shot back. "I told you I love him. He's a good man, and you're trying to belittle him. And as for intimacy, he's actually better. I never comment on your wife or your fascination with younger women." He waved her remarks away dismissively. "Maybe we can resume this when he's less suspicious. When I become director, I'll need a new secretary, and you know what that means." I noticed she smiled faintly at him. "Yes, I do. But if you want more from me..." "I'll think about it," she paused. "No, this is the last time. I love him, and I can't risk losing him. You've been entertaining, but it's over." He yawned and added, "Well, if we have time, let's have another drink and take a nap before dinner. I need to be ready for a phone call around 7 o'clock." I stopped watching. It was too painful, but I continued recording for evidence. It seemed they fell asleep quickly after their conversation. I decided to act. I approached the van and knocked on the side but received no response. Inside, I found his pants, car keys, her phone, and her purse. From the bag I had brought, I took gloves and a few items. I put on the gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints and decided to start with the man. I hesitated between using the cage or handcuffs first but opted for the cage, securing it with a small brass lock. The satisfying clicks of the ratchet were almost cathartic. I then applied superglue to the lock and the keyhole of the handcuffs. Next, I secured Caroline's left wrist with handcuffs. Then, I began stripping the van of any fabric I could find, towels, curtains, and even the rug in front of the fake fireplace. I ensured they had nothing to cover themselves with. Their clothing was neatly folded near the front door, but I gathered it all into a plastic bag. I removed all sharp objects from the drawers to prevent any damage to the furniture. Using their phones, I took several photographs of the scene. Initially, I planned to use only her phone, but I managed to unlock his phone with his thumbprint and disable the passcode. The most challenging task was removing the sheet they were lying on. I ended up cutting it into pieces. Additionally, I took their pillows, toilet paper, coffee jar, and cups but left the milk. I moved on to the next phase. I drove his car and parked it near mine, transferring a folding bicycle I had into it. Their clothes were placed in the back of his car. I had considered multiple ways to deal with his car, disposing of it in a river or setting it on fire, but those options would attract attention. Instead, I drove it to a rough part of town, left it with the doors unlocked and the keys on the dashboard, and walked away. From their belongings, I took the cash from his wallet and her purse, which wasn't much but covered some of my expenses. I left his credit cards on the car seat, thinking that if someone unscrupulous found them, they might use them. I took her credit cards, snapped them in half, and discarded them into a nearby drain. His wallet and her purse went into a garbage bin. I unfolded the bike and made my way toward the holiday park. Once I was in a safer area, I retrieved the slip of paper I had brought from home and dialed a number saved on his phone. It occurred to me that I didn't even know his name. To us, he was just the deputy principal. I could have checked his credit cards for his name but didn't bother. Hello, is this the South Coast Gazette? Yes, who am I speaking with? An anonymous tipster. We don't accept anonymous tips over the phone without verification. I'm sorry, I can't provide that. I work for our local MP and am concerned about something inappropriate. These Greens always act morally superior, but they're not immune to scandal, are they? Right now, he's in a caravan with another man's wife, engaging in some unconventional activity. MPs having affairs isn't groundbreaking news, the voice on the other end replied, but the unconventional aspect adds spice, especially since he's the local Green MP. I sensed their interest as they asked for the location, and I obliged. Then I continued back to the holiday park and found a secluded corner to observe the van and monitor the activity inside, which was minimal. Soon, I noticed a car parked nearby, an odd choice of location, given the circumstances. To occupy myself, I began sending short video clips from my phone to theirs. I followed up by sending images and videos to their entire contact lists, including the South Coast Gazette. This took about 20 minutes. Eventually, the constant ringing and text notifications from their phones became overwhelming, prompting me to switch them off. I then noticed slight movement on the camera. They were waking up. Silently, I positioned myself beside the van and knocked vigorously. The shock on their faces as they woke was remarkable. There was frantic screaming, especially from him, perhaps due to pain. Caroline recoiled, wincing and clutching her wrist. Their panicked movements inside the van were chaotic. Once they realized their clothes were missing, he yelled in frustration while she sobbed uncontrollably. The commotion attracted the attention of the man in the parked car, who exited and approached the van. Leaning out of his window, he inquired if he could assist by contacting the police, sensing something was wrong. It was then that he noticed the camera in the man's car and assumed he was a journalist. Ah, a journalist, he muttered to himself. The journalist, however, was genuinely concerned and began snapping photos before dialing the police. In the tranquil coastal town, where little occurred in early spring, the police arrived promptly. The images captured inside the van shed light on the situation. The police summoned paramedics to assist, but they quickly discovered that the superglue on the locks posed a significant problem. Wire cutters were brought in, but they, too, were affected by the adhesive. The officers managed to separate the couple, but the brass lock and handcuffs remained stubbornly attached. Despite their best efforts, the paramedics couldn't remove all the items that had been glued. It was likely they'd need a specialized solvent, though I wasn't sure one even existed for such extensive use of superglue. Both individuals were eventually taken to the hospital, where I assumed a lot of work awaited them. Satisfied with the outcome, I decided to leave. Before heading home, I packed my toolbox and removed the batteries from their phones. Tempted to discard the phones, I decided they might come in handy later. Once home, I called my wife from my personal phone, which had been lying at home all day next to my computer. Oddly, it went straight to voicemail. At least I managed to register an outgoing call. I removed the device from my computer and deleted several pages of incomprehensible characters that had been generated throughout the day. Then I began filling out several online forms, printed them, signed one, and placed it in an envelope. Around 8:30 p.m., there was a knock at the front door. A young policeman stood there, asking for confirmation of my identity. After confirming, he inquired about the whereabouts of my wife. I explained that she was supposed to be staying at a hotel in Bristol and that I had attempted to contact her by phone without success. The officer then showed me a photo on his phone. "Is this your wife?" he asked. I acknowledged the resemblance but noted she looked disheveled. To my surprise, he informed me that she wasn't in Bristol but at the Christchurch police station, possibly in connection with the caravan we owned there. Perplexed, I mentioned that Caroline was supposed to be in Bristol for a meeting. The officer suggested I inquire directly with her and asked if I could retrieve her. He also questioned how she had ended up at the station and why she couldn't return on her own. I received no answers, only the repeated suggestion to ask her directly. The officer then questioned my whereabouts throughout the day. I explained that I had been at home working online. After jotting down my explanation, he seemed to accept it, though I was concerned about potential scrutiny regarding my friend's car. Still, I clung to the principle of innocent until proven guilty, assuming they had more pressing matters to investigate. Driving to the Christchurch police station, I informed the officers I was there to collect my wife. Upon arrival, one officer asked if I had brought any clothes for her, as she was currently wrapped only in a metallic foil blanket. I admitted I hadn't. It hadn't occurred to me in the rush to get there. Perhaps the young officer who visited my home hadn't mentioned it, or if he had, I must have missed it. When they brought Caroline out, she looked disheveled, with smeared makeup and unkempt hair. She appeared distraught. As she approached me, she instinctively reached out but then froze, realizing she was covered only by the blanket. I gestured for her to stop and handed her an envelope. She seemed to understand its significance immediately, collapsing to the ground in tears. I helped her to her feet and guided her to the car, with one of the officers assisting. While seating her in the car, I noticed a commotion across the parking lot. A woman, whom I thought I recognized, was striking a man draped in a foil blanket with her handbag. The assisting officer quickly left to intervene, pulling her away. Caroline cried throughout the 2-hour drive home, but I wasn't taking her to our house. Instead, I drove to her parents' home. My relationship with them had always been strained. They were deeply religious, while I wasn't. Despite our differences, I respected the principles of morality, equality, and fairness. Still, I wasn't sure how they would react to me arriving with Caroline in such a state, especially after all the photos and videos I had shared with them and others. When we arrived, I circled around to open her door and helped her out. As she stepped out and realized where we were, her expression turned to one of horror. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded, "Please take me home." "No," I replied. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I gave you a choice," I said. "To betray or not to betray. You chose betrayal. I suspected you were having an affair but gave you the opportunity to prove it was in the past so we could move forward. Instead, you continued to betray me." Her mother emerged from the house and, upon seeing her daughter, slapped her. Turning to me, she asked, "Is there any hope?" "None," I replied. Caroline looked at me with desperation. "I'm sorry. Please take me home," she begged. I met her gaze and said firmly, "I gave you a choice, and you ignored it." Her father appeared and guided her into the house while I walked back to the car. Her mother followed me, asking again if there was any chance of reconciliation. I took out my phone and showed her a video clip. It was the moment the man had asked Caroline if they could continue their affair. She had smiled and said, "Yes, I do. You'll want more from me? I'll think about it." I stopped the clip before she eventually said no. Without further comment, I got into the car and drove away. The post-nuptial agreement held up. Caroline sought advice from a reputable divorce attorney, coincidentally one from my rugby club, who informed her she had willingly violated the agreement and had no legal ground to challenge it. She didn't contest the terms. I ended up with the house, over $100,000 in savings, and my MG. As for the two of them, both lost their jobs. They didn't need morality clauses in their contracts, their actions alone brought disrepute to the college. The consequences were swift and public. He went through a divorce, and rumors suggested his ex-wife took him for everything he had. He likely wouldn't work in academia again, and the same seemed true for Caroline. I gifted her the caravan. Personally, I couldn't bring myself to set foot in it again. Jason, who communicates with her only occasionally, mentioned she found minor employment near the coast. I encountered her once at Jason's wedding. She looked worse for wear. I was single at the time and didn't bring a date. She approached me and said, "I'm truly sorry. Can we try again?" I replied, "I gave you a choice, and you chose betrayal." With that, I turned and walked away.